The X-ray showed a clean break, a simple fix. But as I set the 6-year-old's fractured arm, my focus shifted to the woman fiercely gripping his uninjured hand. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I maintain strict professional distance. Yet when this exhausted single mother finally met my eyes, my clinical detachment vanished. I told myself she was just another patient's mom, until her fingers accidentally brushed my wrist and everything shattered. The sliding doors of Lakeshore Medical Center hissed open at 11:47 p.m., and Claire Bennett carried her son through them like a shipwreck survivor, clutching the last piece of driftwood. Leo's face was pale, his right arm dangling at an unnatural angle, and every small jostle made him whimper. Claire's own hands were shaking as he approached the check-in desk, her voice cracking when she tried to speak. "My son. He fell off his skateboard. I think his arm is broken." The night shift nurse took one look and hit the triage button. Claire couldn't stop talking, a stream of details she wasn't sure anyone needed. The ramp in the driveway, the loose gravel, how she'd told him to wear the knee pads but he'd refused, how she should have been watching closer. The nurse nodded and typed, but Claire barely registered the response. A PED team appealed within seconds. A woman in a white coat moved through the fluorescent glare with the calm certainty of someone who had seen 1,000 broken things and knew exactly how to fix them. Dr. Vivian Ashford. Claire had never met her before, but she caught the name on the badge as the doctor knelt beside the gurney. Sharp black bob, gray eyes that did not blink, hands steady as she gently cradled Leo's arm. She didn't ask Claire what happened. She asked Leo. "Hey, buddy, can you tell me your name?" "Leo," his voice wobbled. "I'm Dr. Viv. That's a cool watch you've got. Does it tell time or does it tell dinosaur facts?" Leo let out a shaky little laugh. "It tells both. Did you know T-Rex had tiny arms?" "I did know that." The doctor's voice was low, almost warm, but her focus never left the injury. "And did you also know that T-Rex bones heal way faster than human bones, so you're already behind schedule? We need to get you fixed up." Claire then watched, frozen, as the doctor's hands moved over her son's arm with the quiet authority of someone who had never doubted her own skill. It was strange, in the middle of all that panic, there was something almost beautiful about it. The way she took control without raising her voice. The way she made Leo feel brave, without promising him it wouldn't hurt. "We need an X-ray to confirm the fracture pattern, but I'm fairly certain it's a clean transverse fracture of the radius. That's the good kind. It'll heal well with a cast." Dr. Ashford straightened and finally looked at Claire. "He's going to be fine. I'll take care of him." It was just a sentence, professional and neutral, but Claire felt something in her chest loosen, just a little. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The next hour was a blur of bright lights and beeping machines. Claire sat in the plastic chair by the curtain, her knees pressed together, her hands clasped in her lap. She watched Dr. Ashford talk Leo through every step, the cold gently on the skin for the ultrasound, the click of the X-ray machine, the way she let him pick the color of his cast, green, because it was the color of a triceratops. At one point, Leo asked, "Are you a real dinosaur doctor?" "I'm a real bone doctor," Dr. Ashford replied. "Dinosaurs are your department." Claire almost smiled. She caught the doctor's eye for a second, and Dr. Ashford gave her the smallest nod, a silent signal that said, "I've got this." When the cast was set and Leo was drowsy from the pain medication, Claire finally let herself exhale. She leaned forward and touched her son's hair, her fingers trembling with the last traces of adrenaline. Dr. Ashford was writing something at the small desk in the corner. Her posture was straight, her pen moving in quick think. Efficient strokes. Claire noticed the fine lines around her eyes, the faint shadow under them, signs of a woman who had spent too many nights in this fluorescent world. "Thank you," Claire said quietly. Dr. Ashford looked up. Her gray eyes studied Claire for a moment, and something flickered in them. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a fatigue that matched her own. "Follow up in 1 week for a checkup. The front desk will give you the appointment. If there's any swelling, discoloration, or if his fingers turn blue, come back immediately. Otherwise, keep the cast dry, and no skateboards for at least 6 weeks." It was a list, professional, neutral, complete. Claire nodded, but what she really wanted to say was,
I saw you, in that moment when you held my son's hand and told him it was okay to be scared. I saw that you didn't have to be kind, but you were, and I don't know why that hit me so hard." She didn't say any of it, she just whispered, 6 weeks, got it. Dr. Ashford turned back to her notes, and Claire gathered her sleeping son into her arms. As she walked out of the emergency bay, she glanced back over her shoulder. The doctor was still writing. Her white coat was slightly wrinkled at the shoulders. There was a cup of cold coffee on the desk beside her, untouched. Claire pushed through the sliding doors into the Chicago night, and the cold air hit her face like a splash of water. She shifted Leo's Wilt in her arms and walked toward the parking lot, not knowing that on the other side of those doors, Dr. Vivian Ashford had stopped writing. She was staring at the empty space where Claire had been standing. She told herself it was nothing, just another patient, another mother, another night. But her hand hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before
think finished. I think someone who was not completely springing to his helpy things that would be, said the perp if it his app, was amosed, they just tend that 1 minute to be more time like it inbrained. Then when he went with my neck at the repair and sino deck to the ground, critically, the dark circles under her eyes had become permanent residents. Her hair was in a messy bun that had started out as a ponytail the day before. She looked exactly like what she was. A single mother, running on coffee and sheer determination. From the kitchen, she heard Leo's voice. "Mom, I can't find my dinosaur socks." "Check under your bed," she called back, drying her face with a towel that smelled faintly of laundry she'd forgotten to fold. The apartment was small but warm, rent-controlled in a pre-war building near Lincoln Park with creaky floorboards and a radiator that clanked like it had opinions. Claire had lived here since before Leo was born, back when she was married to a man who promised her forever, and then left when forever turned out to be harder than he'd expected. She didn't think about him much anymore, not the good parts and not the bad. What she thought about was Leo, his laugh, his endless questions, the way he held her hand when he was scared. And right now, she was thinking about Dr. Vivian Ashford. It wasn't a conscious thought, it was more like a splinter, small, buried under the skin, but pressing every time she moved. The way the doctor had knelt beside Leo, not abut him, the way her hands had been so steady, so sure, even when the room was chaos. The way she'd looked at Claire for just a second longer than necessary before turning back to the X-ray. Claire shook her head and reached for her coffee. "Mom! Found them!" Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding up a pair of socks with tiny green dinosaurs printed on them. His left arm was in a bright blue cast, decorated with stickers the nurses had given him, stars, a rocket ship, a smiling sun. Claire smiled. "Good job, baby. Now let me help you put them on." She knelt in front of him, and as she eased the cast through the sock's opening, Leo said, "Is Dr. Viv going to be there today?" "She said we need to check your cast and make sure everything's healing right." "Can I show her my new dinosaur drawing?" Claire paused. "You drew another one?" Leo nodded seriously. "It's her, but with a stethoscope, and she's wearing a stethoscope on her tail." "Her tail?" "Every dinosaur has a tail, Mom, even Dr. Dinosaurs." Claire laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her. She kissed the top of his head. "Finish your cereal, we don't want to be late." The hospital looked different in daylight. Claire pushed through the sliding doors with Leo's hand in hers, and the fluorescent lights felt less harsh, the air less sterile. There were families in the waiting room, a toddler playing with blocks, an older woman knitting something pink. It looked almost ordinary, until she saw Dr. Ashford walking down the corridor. The woman moved like she owned the building. Her white coat was crisped, her dark hair a sharp bob that caught the light. She was holding a tablet, reading something, and didn't look up until she was almost beside them. Then she stopped. "Mrs. Bennett?" Her voice was the same, low, composed, professional, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker. "Claire, please," Claire said, and she felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Bennett is my ex-husband's mother." Dr. Ashford's mouth twitched, just barely. "Claire, then. And Leo, how's the arm?" "Good." Leo held up his cast proudly,
I drew a picture of you. Do you want to see? Vivian blinked. For a moment she looked caught off guard, a crack in the polished surface. Then she nodded. I'd like that. Leo dug into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it with the careful reverence of a museum curator. It was a dinosaur, green, with a big smile, a white coat drawn in crayon, and a stethoscope wrapped around its neck. On its chest, Leo had written in wobbly letters, DR 9. Vivian stared at the drawing for a long moment. Claire held her breath. Leo, Vivian said quietly, this is the best thing I've seen all week. Leo beamed. The exam was quick. Vivian checked the cast, pressed gently around the edges, and declared that everything was healing exactly as it should. Leo asked her 3 questions about Tyrannosaurus Rex's arm length, and she answered each one with the same patience she'd shown in the ER. When they were done, Claire gathered her bag and Leo's jacket. Thank you, Dr. Ashford, really. Vivian nodded. She was already turning back to her tablet, her professional mask sliding back into place. Claire led Leo toward the exit, but at the door she glanced back. Vivian was standing at the nurse's station, the drawing in her hand. She was looking at it, not dismissively, not politely, but really looking, like she was memorizing it. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. Claire turned away quickly, her heart doing something she didn't have a name for. That evening, after Leo was asleep, Vivian sat alone in her office. The hospital was quiet. The night shift had taken from, and the corridors were empty except for the soft hum of machines and the occasional page over the intercom. She pulled out the drawing again. She told herself she was just appreciating a child's artwork, that it was nothing more than a cute gesture from a grateful patient. But she had already made a copy. Earlier that afternoon, she'd stood at the copy machine in the administrative wing, a machine she never used because her assistant handled all the paperwork, and she'd pressed the button with her own hand. The original was in Leo's file. The copy was in her desk drawer, underneath a stack of journal articles she'd been meaning to read for months. She closed the drawer and locked it. Then she sat back in her chair, stared at the ceiling, and thought about a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile, who had walked into her emergency room 1 week ago and changed something she didn't yet understand. She didn't know why she'd made that copy. She just did. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Vivian was in her office, reviewing a post-op report she'd already read twice, when the ER paged her about a 6-year-old with a post-cast complication. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, 2 floors down, 30 seconds faster. And by the time she reached the examination bay, she'd already run through 3 possible diagnoses in her head. She didn't expect to see Claire Bennett standing by the bed, holding Leo's hand. Dr. Ashford? Claire's voice was calm, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the stretcher. I'm sorry, I know it's late. He said his arm felt funny, and I didn't want to wait until morning. Vivian's eyes moved from Claire's face to Leo's splinted arm, then back. She didn't say it was fine. She never said things like that. Instead, she pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and knelt beside the bed. Show me where it feels funny, Leo. The boy pointed at a spot just above the cast. His lower lip trembled, but he didn't cry. It feels like ants are walking inside my arm. Vivian pressed gently around the edge of the cast. The skin was warm but not swollen. No signs of infection. That's a good sign, she said, her voice low and steady. It means the bone is healing, the nerves is waking up. It'll feel strange for a few days, but it's normal. Leo blinked at her. So, I don't need another shot? No. Not even a little one? Vivian's mouth almost curved. Not even a little one. She wrote a note in the chart, explained the signs to watch for, and told Claire she could take him home. It was a simple consult, nothing urgent. She could have sent a resident, but she hadn't. She told herself it was because Leo was her patient, because continuity of care mattered, because she was thorough. She didn't say the real reason. Claire was gathering Leo's things when she paused. She looked at the wall clock, now past midnight, and then at Vivian, who was already turning to leave. Dr. Ashford? Vivian stopped. How long have you been here? The question caught her off guard. She checked her watch without thinking. Since 7 this morning. 36 hours, Claire said quietly. We're 6 hours and you're still here. It's a long shift. It's a long life, too. Claire said it without judgment, without that pitying tone Vivian had learned to recognize from people who thought they understood what it meant to carry other people's lives in your hands. She just said it, like she was stating a fact about the weather. Vivian didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Claire shifted Leo to her other hip and smiled, that tired, warm smile that Vivian had been replaying in her mind for a week. I'll be right back. Can you watch him for a minute? Before Vivian could answer, Claire handed her the bag and walked out of the exam bay. Vivian stood there holding a dinosaur print backpack, staring at the door. Leo looked up at her. Dr. Viv, did you know that some dinosaurs had feathers? I did know that, Leo. Did you know that T-Rex had tiny arms but could still lift 100 pounds? I did not know that. Leo nodded, satisfied. That's my new favorite fact. Vivian looked down at his backpack. There was a small keychain attached to the zipper, a hand-painted stone shaped like a turtle with tiny flowers on its shell. She recognized the art style from the drawing in her drawer. Claire had painted it. She was still looking at the turtle when Claire returned. She was holding a foam cup from the coffee shop on the ground floor. Steam rose from the lid. I know you probably have coffee in your office, Claire said, setting the cup on the counter. But this isn't coffee. It's the soup from the place across the street, the one with the red awning. They have a beef barley that's, well, it's warm, and it's not from a vending machine. She pulled a folded sticky note from her pocket and pressed it onto the cup. Thank you for coming down tonight, and for remembering his name. Most doctors don't. Then she took Leo's hand and walked out, leaving Vivian alone in the empty exam bay. Vivian stood there for a long moment. She looked at the cup. She looked at the door. She picked up the note. It said in neat, rounded handwriting, "Take care of yourself, too. C." She read it 3 times. Then she carried the cup back to her office, sat down at Healy's desk, and unscrewed the lid. The soup was still hot, beef barley, just like Claire had said. It smelled like someone's kitchen, not a hospital. She took a sip, then another. She didn't realize she'd been hungry until she tasted it. The cup sat empty on her desk for the rest of the night. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Not yet. She told herself she was just being wasteful, that she'd toss it in the morning. She didn't. At 3 a.m., during a lull between consults, she picked up the sticky note and pressed it into the pages of her journal. The one she never wrote in. The one that sat at the bottom of her bag like a dead weight she carried everywhere but never used. She didn't know why she kept it. She just did. Outside, the Chicago skyline flickered with late-night lights. The lake was dark and still, a sheet of black glass under the moon. Somewhere in the city, Claire Bennett was tucking Leo into bed, probably reading him a story about dinosaurs, probably not thinking about the surgeon who still had her soup cup on her desk. But Vivienne was thinking about her. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let the quiet hum of the hospital fill the space around her. She had another 8 hours before her shift ended. There were patients to see, rounds to make, decisions to own. But for just this moment, she let herself sit in the warmth of something that wasn't a diagnosis or a procedure or a wall. She let herself feel the weight of a note that said, simply, "Take care of yourself, too." And she didn't know it yet, but something inside her, something she'd locked away so long she'd forgotten it existed, had begun to crack. The cast came off on a Tuesday afternoon. Leo sat on the examination table, his arm wrapped in a plaster cocoon that had accumulated a small museum of stickers, doodles, and one suspicious-looking stain that Claire had chosen not to investigate. He was pale but trying to be brave, his jaw set in a way that reminded Claire of the face he made when he was about to get a shot. "You ready, Captain?" Vivienne asked, picking up the cast saw. Her voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used in the operating room, Claire imagined. Leo nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "I'll take that as a yes." The saw whirred to life. Claire watched Vivienne's hands, steady, precise, moving with the kind of confidence that only came from years of practice.
The plaster fell away in sections, dust settling on the paper sheet beneath. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, and Claire reached out to hold his free hand. "Almost done," Vivian said. "You're doing great, Captain. 10 more seconds." The last piece of plaster came off. Leo looked pale and thin underneath, the skin slightly flaky from weeks of confinement. He opened his eyes and stared at it like it was a stranger. "Can I move it?" "Slowly," Vivian said. "It'll feel stiff for a few days, but you can start using it gently. No skateboards for another 2 weeks, though." Leo groaned. 2 weeks? Or 3, if you don't follow instructions. Claire smiled, still holding Leo's hand. She looked up to thank Vivian, and that was when it happened. As she shifted her weight, her hand slipped from Leo's and brushed against Vivian's wrist. It was barely a second. A graze of skin against skin, warm and unexpected. Claire felt the faint pulse under Vivian's sleeve, the slight roughness of her watch strap. Vivian went still, her pen hovering over the chart. Neither of them moved. The air in the room changed, stretched, thinned, became something almost tangible. Claire could hear the hum of the lights, the distant beep of a monitor from the hallway. She could see the tiny flecks of gray in Vivian's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Then Vivian pulled her hand back, just an inch, and returned to writing. "Everything looks good," she said, her voice slightly quieter than before. "I'll send the discharge instructions to the front desk." "Thank you," Claire managed. She was aware that her voice sounded strange, too soft, too careful. She kept her eyes on Leo, on his pale arm, on anything that wasn't Vivian's face. But she felt the ghost of that touch on her skin for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, Claire found herself in the hospital cafeteria. It had been an accident, or that was what she told herself. The adult painting class she'd signed up for 3 weeks ago met on Wednesday nights in a community center across town. But the center had been closed for renovations, and the instructor had arranged a temporary space here. Claire had forgotten, until she got the email that morning. She stood in the cafeteria line with a tray, feeling out of place among the scrubs in white coats. She grabbed a salad she didn't want and a bottle of water, then turned to find a seat. And there, in the far corner, sat Vivian Ashford. She was alone, a cup of coffee in front of her, her phone face down on the table. She wasn't wearing her white coat, just a dark sweater and jeans, her hair slightly tousled, as if she'd run her fingers through it one too many times. She looked smaller somehow, softer, like a different person from the woman who commanded the ER with a single glance. Claire hesitated. The rational part of her brain said, "Sit somewhere else, don't make it awkward, just eat your salad and go to class." But her feet didn't listen. She walked to Vivian's table. "Is this seat taken?" Vivian looked up. For a moment, Claire saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. Then she shook her head. "No, go ahead." Claire sat down. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with the memory of that afternoon's accidental touch, the unspoken question of what it meant. "I didn't know you came here," Claire said, for lack of anything better. "I don't, usually." Vivian gestured vaguely toward the coffee machine. "I just needed a break from my office. It's a nice space. The light is good." Vivian looked at the window, then back at Claire. "You're not here for the food." It wasn't a question. Claire smiled. "I have a painting class. The community center is being renovated, so they moved it here temporarily. Wednesday nights." "Ah." Veronique nodded slowly. "That explains the easels I saw in the conference room." They fell into silence again. Claire picked at her salad. Vivian drank her coffee. The cafeteria hummed with the low murmur of conversations, the clatter of trays, the occasional announcement over the intercom. And then, Vivian said very quietly, "That painting, the one Leo brought to his first follow-up." Claire looked up. "The dinosaur in the white coat?" "I kept it." Vivian's voice was careful, like she was testing the weight of each word. "I put it in my office. Patients' parents always ask about it." Claire felt something warm spread through her chest. Leo will be thrilled to hear that. He's been drawing a new one. A T-Rex with a paintbrush. I'd like to see it. The words hung in the air between them. Claire held Vivian's gaze for a beat longer than she should have. I'll bring it next time, she said. Vivian nodded once, then stood up, picking up her empty cup. I should get back. Paperwork doesn't do itself. Of course. She walked toward the door, then paused. Without turning around, she said, The class, what time does it end? 9. Another pause. There's a good coffee shop across the street. They stay open late. She didn't wait for an answer. She just walked out, the door swinging shut behind her, leaving Claire sitting alone at the table with a salad she'd forgotten to eat and a heart that was beating faster than it had any right to. That night, after the painting class ended and Claire was walking to her car, she found herself looking across the street. The coffee shop was still open, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. She stood there for a long moment. Then she got into her car and drove home. But she thought about that cup of coffee, the one Vivian had mentioned, the one she hadn't offered to share all the way back to her apartment. And she wondered what would have happened if he was S. The courtroom smelled like old paper and anxiety. Claire sat at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Margaret, was flipping through a stack of documents beside her. Across the aisle, Leo's father, Derek, sat with his attorney, a sharp-suited man who had spent the morning making Claire sound like a negligent mother who let her child play on broken sidewalks. The judge had called a 15-minute recess. Claire hadn't moved since they sat back down. Dr. Vivian Ashford to the stand. The voice belonged to Margaret, but Claire barely heard it. She watched Vivian walk toward the witness box, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal blazer and a simple white blazer.
Ingon the Strucky. Be close, Lou. No white coat, no stethoscope, just a woman who looked like she belonged in a room full of people trying to find the truth. Vivian was sworn in. Her voice was steady when she stated her name, her title, her years of experience. Margaret began the direct examination. Dr. Ashford, you treated Leo Bennett on the night of March 12th. Can you describe the nature of his injury? A closed fracture of the left distal radius, a clean break common in children his age from falls, skateboards, bikes, playground equipment. And in your professional opinion, was this injury consistent with neglect? Vivian's gaze didn't waver. No. It was consistent with a child learning to ride a skateboard without proper wrist guards. The alignment of the fracture, the mechanism of injury, everything pointed to a single impact, not repeated trauma or lack of supervision. Derek's attorney stood up. Objection. The witness is offering an opinion on parenting standards outside her specialty. The judge overruled. Dr. Ashford is a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. She can speak to injury patterns. Vivian continued. I also reviewed the records from Leo's previous pediatric visits. There is no history of unexplained injuries, no pattern of delayed care. His immunization records are complete, his growth charts are consistent, and his mother's report of the accident timeline was verified by the emergency room intake notes. She paused. In my experience, parents who bring their child to the ER with a broken arm, who stay through the entire procedure, who ask questions about recovery and rehabilitation, those are not signs of neglect. Those are signs of a parent who cares. Claire felt her throat tighten. She pressed her fingernails into her palm to keep from crying. Cross-examination was shorter but more aggressive. Derek's attorney tried to push Vivian into admitting that Claire had been distracted during the ER visit, that she had seemed overwhelmed. Vivian's answer was quiet but firm. She was holding her son's hand while I set his bone. She was whispering to him in a calm voice. She was present in every way that mattered. I would not change a single word of my report. The attorney sat down. Vivian was dismissed. She didn't look at Claire as she stepped down. She walked past the defense table, her heels clicking against the worn floor, and took a seat in the back row of the gallery. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur. More witnesses, more arguments. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, Claire felt like she had been holding her breath for 3 hours. She found Vivian in the parking lot. It was late afternoon, the April sunlight slanting through the trees, making long shadows on the asphalt. Vivian was standing by her car, keys in hand, about to get in.
Dr. Ashford? Vivian turned. Her face was unreadable, but her shoulders relaxed slightly when she saw it was Claire. I just wanted to say… Claire stopped. She had rehearsed this in her head during the break, but now the words felt too small. Thank you. What you said in there. It meant everything. Vivian looked down at her keys. I just stated the facts. No, you didn't. Claire stepped closer. You could have said the fracture was consistent with a fall, and that would have been enough. But you didn't. You talked about the way I held his hand, the way I whispered to him. You saw things you didn't have to see. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her gray eyes were softer than Claire had ever seen them. I see a lot. Parents in my line of work, she said. Most of them are scared. Some of them are trying. A few of them are both. You're one of the few. Claire didn't know what to say. She stood there, the spring wind lifting her hair, feeling like something had shifted between them, something that didn't have a name yet. That night, Claire sat on her couch after putting Leo to bed. She stared at her phone for a long time. Then she typed, Leo said he wants to thank you in person. I do too. She stared at the message. Her thumb hovered over the send button. She pressed it. 3 minutes passed. 5, she was about to put the phone down when it buzzed. One word, how? It was in Chinese. She knew Vivian's grandmother was from Shanghai. She had mentioned it once, in passing, during Leo's second visit. Claire smiled. She didn't know why, but that single character, that quiet, one-syllable yes, felt more impactful than 1,000 words. She typed back, Saturday? There's a coffee shop across from the hospital. The one you mentioned. This time the reply came faster. I'll be there. 7 p.m. Claire put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She had a feeling she wasn't going to sleep much tonight. Across town, Vivian sat in her apartment, the phone still in her hand. She looked at the message again, the confirmation, the plan, the promise of Saturday. She hadn't been to that coffee shop with anyone in 2 years. She put the phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to end. The coffee shop meeting never happened, not because Vivian dumped Claire up. Not because Claire changed her mind, but because the universe, in its cruel sense of timing, decided to throw a curveball neither of them saw coming. It was Thursday afternoon, 2 days before their scheduled Saturday. Claire had taken a half day from school to pick Leo up early. His kindergarten had a teacher training day. She decided to stop by the hospital on the way home just to drop off a small thing, a thank you card Leo had insisted on making. It had a crayon drawing of a dinosaur wearing a stethoscope with the words, Thank you, DR9, written in wobbly capital letters. Claire walked into the pediatric wing, Leo's hand in hers. The nurse at the front desk recognized her and smiled. Dr. Ashford is in her office, honey. Go ahead. Claire thanked her and walked down the corridor. She could see the door to Vivian's office was slightly ajar. She was about to knock when she heard a voice from inside. A woman's voice. Warm, familiar in a way that made Claire's stomach tighten. Vivian, please, just hear me out. I didn't come here to fight. Claire stopped. Her hand hovered in the air, inches from the door. She could see through the crack. Vivian standing behind her desk, arms crossed, her face unreadable. And across from her, a woman, tall, blonde, elegant in a way that spoke of money and confidence. She was leaning forward, her hand resting on the edge of the desk, her expression pleading. I know I hurt you, the woman said. I know I said things I can't take back. But I've changed, Viv. I want to try again. I want us to try again. Claire's heart stopped. She didn't hear Vivian's response. She didn't need to. The image was enough, the two of them. Alone in that office, the intimacy of the conversation, the way the woman looked at Vivian at none like she had every right to be there. Leo tugged at her hand. Mommy, why are we standing here? Claire blinked. She stepped back, her hand dropping to her side. We're not, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We're leaving. She turned and walked away, Leo's small hand still in hers. She didn't look back.
The card with the dinosaur and the wobbly letters stayed in her pocket. Vivian didn't know Claire had been there. She stood in her office, watching Amanda pace back and forth, her words washing over her like static. She wasn't listening. She was thinking about Saturday, about the coffee shop, about Claire. "Vivian, did you hear me?" She looked up. "I heard you. And my answer is still no." Amanda stopped pacing. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "I figured. But I had to try. I had to at least say I'm sorry." "Say it then. And leave." Amanda looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry. For everything. For leaving. For the words I said. For not seeing you." Vivian didn't respond. She just stood there, her arms still crossed, her face still unreadable. Amanda walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the handle. "She must be someone special. The one who made you say no to me." Vivian said nothing. Amanda left. That evening, Claire sat on her couch, staring at her phone. There was an unread message from Vivian. "Looking forward to Saturday? 7 p.m. still works?" Claire's thumb hovered over the screen. She wanted to type back. She wanted to ask who that woman was. She wanted to believe there was an explanation, but she couldn't. The image of them together, the blonde woman leaning in, the intimacy of the gesture, played on repeat in her mind. And the words, "I want us to try again." She put the phone down without replying. She wrote in sleep that night. The next morning, when Leo's grandmother offered to take him to his follow-up appointment, Claire agreed without hesitation. She couldn't face Vivian. Not yet, maybe not ever. Vivian arrived at work on Friday to find that Claire had canceled the afternoon appointment. The nurse said Leo's grandmother would be bringing him in instead. No explanation. She sat in her office, staring at her calendar. The Saturday coffee shop meeting was still there, marked with a small heart emoji she'd added without thinking. She picked up her phone. No new messages from Claire. She typed, "Everything okay?" Then she deleted it. She typed, "Is Saturday still good?" Then she deleted it too. She put the phone down and stared out the window at the gray Chicago sky. Something was wrong. She could feel it, but for the first time in 2 years, she didn't know how to ask. The Saturday came and went. Vivian sat alone in the coffee shop, a cup of black coffee growing cold in front of her. She stayed for an hour, watching the door. Claire never showed up. When she finally left, she threw the untouched cup in the trash, and she told herself it didn't matter, but her chest ached in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. The week after the missed Saturday felt like walking through fog. Vivian threw herself into work with a ferocity that made her residents nervous. She picked up extra shifts. She reviewed cases she'd already signed off on. She stayed in the hospital until the janitor came to vacuum the hallways at midnight. On Monday, she passed the coffee shop on her way home and didn't look inside. On Tuesday, she deleted Claire's contact from her phone. Then she went to the recently deleted folder and restored it. Then she put the phone in her desk drawer and touch it for the rest of the night. On Wednesday morning, she stood in front of her closet and stared at her clothes longer than usual. She told herself it was because she couldn't decide which sweater to wear. It was a lie. She knew exactly why she was hesitating. Wednesday was the night of Claire's adult painting class at the hospital's community education center, the same class Vivian had pretended not to notice for the past 3 weeks. She chose a charcoal gray blazer instead of her usual black one. She told herself it was because she felt like a change. Another lie. The hospital cafeteria at 6:45 p.m. was quiet. The dinner rush had ended, and the late shift workers hadn't started their breaks yet. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A single janitor mopped the far corner. Vivian walked in with her laptop bag, ordered a black coffee from the self-serve station, and took her usual table in the corner near the window, the one with a view of the parking lot. She sat down, opened her laptop, stared at the screen without reading a word. Then she stood up, walked back to the counter, and ordered a second coffee, a latte with oat milk, the kind Claire had ordered that first time they'd crossed paths here by accident. She set the latte on the opposite side of the table, then she sat back down and waited. At 7:03 p.m., the door to the cafeteria swung open. Claire walked in carrying a canvas bag with a tube of rolled paper sticking out. She was wearing a soft blue sweater that made her look younger, more tired, and absolutely heartbreaking all at once. She stopped when she saw Vivian. Their eyes met across the room. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights hummed. The janitor's mop swished against the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang and stopped. Claire's hand tightened on the strap of her bag. Vivian could see her weighing options. Turn around, leave, pretend she hadn't seen anything. Instead, Claire's gaze dropped to the table, to the second cup of coffee sitting untouched on the opposite side. She walked over. She didn't sit down at first. She just stood there, looking at the latte like it was a question she didn't know how to answer. "It's oat milk," Vivienne said quietly. I remembered. Claire's breath caught, just barely, just a tiny hitch in her breathing that anyone else would have missed. She pulled out the chair and sat down. They didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. Vivienne scrolled through her email. Claire pulled a sketchbook from her bag and started drawing. The only sounds were the tapping of keys, the scratch of pencil on paper, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. It should have been awkward. Two women who'd spent the past week avoiding each other, suddenly sitting across from each other with nothing but a cup of coffee as a peace offering. But it wasn't awkward. It was something else, something fragile and careful, like the moment after a storm when the air is still damp but the sun is starting to break through. At 7:23, Claire spoke without looking up from her sketchbook. "Leo asked about you." Vivienne's fingers paused over the keyboard. "He wanted to know why we didn't go to the coffee shop on Saturday," Claire continued, her pencil still moving. "I told him you had to work." "That's not true," Vivienne said. Claire looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept well in days. "I know," she said softly, but it was easier than telling him the truth. "Which is?" Claire held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he looked back down at her sketchbook and didn't answer. Vivienne didn't push. She just went back to scrolling through her email, letting the silence settle between them again. At 7:45, Claire finished her latte and stood up. "I have class in 15 minutes, she said. She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for the coffee." Vivienne nodded. "Same time next week?" It wasn't a question she planned to ask. The words came out before she could stop them. Claire studied her face for a moment, searching for something. Vivienne wasn't sure what. "Same time," Claire said finally. She walked toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the handle. "Vivienne?" "Yes?" Claire didn't turn around. "The Saturday coffee shop. I wanted to be there. I couldn't." Then she pushed the door open and was gone. Vivienne sat alone in the corner for another 20 minutes, staring at the empty cup on the other side of the table. She had so many questions. Why didn't you come? What did you see? What are you so afraid of? But she didn't ask them, because she knew the answer to the last one already. She was afraid of the same thing. The next Wednesday, Vivienne was at the same table at 6:45 p.m. She ordered 2 coffees without hesitation. At 7:01, Claire walked in. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the table, set down her bag, and sat across from Vivienne like she'd been doing it for years. They didn't talk much, just like the first time. But Claire's sketchbook was open, and this time, Vivienne noticed what she was drawing. It was a dinosaur. A T-Rex with tiny arms, wearing a white coat and holding a coffee cup. Vivienne felt something crack open in her chest. "That's me?" she asked. Claire took a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Leo's influence. He said Dr. Viv needs a dinosaur version." "It's accurate," Vivienne said, pointing at the tiny arms. "The T-Rex proportions, I mean." Claire laughed. It was a small laugh, barely more than a breath, but it was real. And for the first time in a week, the fog between them lifted just a little. They stayed until 8:30 that night. Claire finished her sketch. Vivienne pretended to work on a presentation but spent most of the time watching Claire's pencil move across the page. When they finally stood up to leave, Claire paused. "Next Wednesday?" Vivienne nodded. "I'll be here." Claire tucked the sketchbook into her bag. "I know," she said. "That's why I'll come." She walked away before Vivienne could respond, but Vivienne didn't need to respond. "TREX, Claire will take." "Heat," words echoed in her head all the way home. The next Wednesday, Vivienne arrived at the cafeteria at 6:45. She ordered 2 coffees, black for herself, oat milk latte for Claire, and sat down at their usual table by the window. She was halfway through her notes when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Patel, the hospital's legal liaison. "Do you know Claire Bennett personally? I just got a call from her lawyer. The custody case has escalated. The father's team submitted records antidepressant prescription from 2 years ago. They're arguing it affects her fitness as a parent. Vivian's hand froze over the keyboard. She typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on, "She's a patient's mother. I saw her son for a fracture. What's the status?" Dr. Patel replied within seconds. "Emergency hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Her lawyer is scrambling for expert testimony to counter the narrative. I thought you should know, given you testified last time." Vivian sent her phone face down on the table. The cafeteria lights hummed. The coffee in front of her was still too hot to drink. She looked at the empty seat across from her, Claire's seat. At exactly 7 o'clock, Claire walked through the cafeteria doors. She was wearing the same gray sweater she'd worn the first time Vivian had seen her at the hospital, the one with a small paint stain on the left sleeve. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She saw Vivian and managed a small wave. Vivian stood up as Claire approached. She didn't say hello. Instead, she pushed the oat milk latte across the table and said, "Sit down, drink this." Claire raised an eyebrow but sat. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, the gesture automatic, as if her body remembered the comfort, either her mind was elsewhere. "You look exhausted," Vivian said quietly. "I've had better weeks." Claire took a sip of the latte. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Leo's dad's lawyer filed new documents. They're trying to paint me as unstable. They found out I saw a therapist a couple years ago. I wasn't even on medication for long. It was just for anxiety after the divorce. But they're spinning it as if I was—" Her voice cracked. She set the cup down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I can't lose him, Vivian. I can't." Vivian sat back down. She didn't reach across the table. She didn't say, "It will be okay." She just sat there, present, steady. "Is there anything I can do?" Vivian asked. Claire dropped her hands and stared at the table. "Unless you have a time machine to go back and tell my past self not to ask my doctor for help when I was struggling, I don't think so." "That's not fair to say," Vivian said, her voice firm but not harsh. "You asked for help when you needed it. That's not a weakness. That's the strongest thing a person can do." Claire looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't let the tears fall. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," she said. Vivian was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone. She pulled up her conversation with Dr. Patel and turned the screen toward Claire. "The hospital's legal team just informed me about the evidence," Vivian said. "I have a friend in psychiatry, Dr. Ross. She's the one who treated you 2 years ago. She's also the most respected expert witness in the state for custody cases." Claire's eyes widened. "You know Dr. Ross? We did our residency together." Vivian's voice was level, controlled. "I already texted her. She said she can review Ram records tonight and prepare a statement for the hearing tomorrow. If her testimony counters their narrative, the judge will see the context, that you proactively sought treatment, you completed it successfully, and you've been stable for over a year with no recurrence." Claire stared at her. "You did that already? Before I even got here?" Vivian put her phone back in her pocket. "I didn't know if you'd show up tonight, but I wanted to be ready in case you did." The tears Claire had been holding back finally spilled over. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, but they kept coming. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Vivian said. "Just drink your coffee." Claire let out a sound that was half laugh, half cry. She picked up the cup and took a long sip. The cafeteria was quiet around them. An elderly janitor was mopping the far corner. The vending machine hummed its steady hum. "Do you remember what I told you last week?" Claire asked, her voice raw. "About how I wanted to go to the cafe that Saturday, but I couldn't." Vivian nodded. "I was in my car. I drove halfway there. I even parked outside the cafe. And then I saw you through the window, sitting alone, and I just—" Claire shook her head. "I saw that woman come in, the one who looked like she knew you. She sat across from you, and I thought that was it. That you'd moved on, that I'd imagined everything." Vivian's jaw tightened. "Claire, that woman was Amanda. My ex-wife," Vivian said quietly. "She came to apologize. She's engaged to someone else now. She said she wanted closure. I told her I'd already closed that door years ago." Claire's breath caught. "She's your ex-wife? You never told me." "I didn't know how." Vivian's voice dropped. "I didn't want you to think I was still tangled up in something that ended a long time ago.
And I didn't want to explain the whole story in a text message. I wanted to tell you in person. But then you stopped showing up. Claire stared at her coffee cup. The milk had left a thin white trail on the inside of the glass. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. I should have asked. I assumed. Don't apologize, Vivian's voice softened. We both assumed. That's what people do when they're scared. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Vivian said, I'll pick you up tomorrow at 7:30. We'll go to the courthouse together. Dr. Ross will meet us there. Claire nodded. Okay, and Claire? Claire looked up. Vivian held her gaze. You're not going to lose him. I won't let that happen. It wasn't a promise. It was a certainty. Claire believed her. The courthouse smelled like old wood and anxiety. Claire sat on the hard bench in the hallway, her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. Leo was with her mother in the waiting room down the hall, coloring dinosaurs on a piece of scrap paper. She could hear his voice asking, Can Dr. Viv come see it after? Claire closed her eyes. The door opened. Vivian stepped out in a charcoal suit, her black hair pinned back, a slim leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She looked like someone who belonged in a room where decisions were made. She sat down next to Claire without a word. Dr. Ross is inside, Vivian said quietly. She's reviewing the records with the judge. The other side tried to argue that your prescription history indicated a pattern of instability. Dr. Ross is explaining that you completed the full course of treatment and were discharged as recovered over a year ago. Claire nodded. She couldn't speak. Vivian's hand fell. Not to touch Claire, just to rest on the bench between them, palm up. An offering, not a demand. Claire stared at that open hand, the same hand that had set Leo's bones with steady precision. The same hand that had held a coffee cup in the hospital cafeteria every Wednesday night waiting for her to sit down. She didn't take it, not yet. But she stopped shaking. The bailiff called Claire's name 20 minutes later. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. Wood paneling, a high ceiling, fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Claire's ex-husband sat on the opposite side with his lawyer, his tie too tight, his jaw set. He didn't look at her. Claire took the stand. The questions came in waves. His lawyer's voice was smooth, practiced. Had she ever taken medication for anxiety? Yes. Had she ever missed a parent-teacher conference because of fatigue? Once. Had she ever asked a neighbor to watch Leo for an extra hour when she needed to finish grading papers? A few times. Each answer felt like a small cut. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to bleed. Then Vivian stood up. She approached the witness stand with the same calm she carried into an operating room. She asked Claire 3 questions. The first was about Leo's recovery. How many follow-up appointments she had attended, how she had adjusted his sleeping position to accommodate the cast, how she had learned to braid his hair left-handed so she wouldn't pull his arm. The second question was about the medication. Claire answered honestly. She had started it after the divorce, when she couldn't sleep and couldn't eat, and couldn't stop crying in the shower. She had finished the prescription, attended every therapy session, and stopped when her doctor said she was ready. The third question was about the neighbor, who watched Leo those extra hours. What was her name? Vivian asked. Mrs. Alvarez, Claire said. She lives 2 doors down. She's 73. She knits sweaters for all the kids on the block, and she calls Leo her little dinosaur expert. Vivian nodded. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense has tried to characterize Ms. Bennett as a negligent parent based on isolated incidents that any single mother would recognize as normal life. I would submit that the evidence shows the opposite. A mother who built a support system, followed medical advice, and never let her own struggles compromise her child's well-being. She paused. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I see parents at their best and worst every day. Ms. Bennett is one of the best us ever met. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. The judge adjourned for deliberation. Claire walked out of the courtroom on legs that didn't feel like her own. She found a bench in the hallway and sat down, her head in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too tired. Vivian sat down beside her. This time she didn't leave space between them. The judge will rule by end of day, Vivian said. Dr. Ross's testimony was solid. You did well up there. Thank you, Claire whispered. Don't thank me, I just told the truth. Claire lifted her head and looked at Vivian. Really looked.
the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw, the way she sat upright as if holding herself together by force of will. "You didn't have to do any of this," Claire said. "You barely know me." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I know that you bring your son soup when he's sick, even if you have to reheat it 3 times because he falls asleep before finishing. I know that you paint rock thing on weekends because it makes him laugh. I know that you stayed up all night reading about pediatric fractures after Leo's cast went on because you wanted to understand what he was going through." She turned to face Claire fully. "I know that you're scared of losing him. And I know that you're scared of letting anyone close enough to help. I know because I am too." Claire's breath caught. "Vivian, let me finish." Vivian's voice cracked, just slightly. "My ex-wife told me I loved my work more than her. She was right. I did. Because work was safe. Work didn't leave. Work didn't look at me and decide I wasn't enough." She looked down at her hands. "I've been hiding in that hospital for 3 years. I thought if I just kept working, I wouldn't have to feel anything. Then you walked into my ER with a crying boy and a broken arm, and you looked at me like I was just a person. Not a surgeon. Not a cold machine. Just someone who might care." Claire reached out. Her fingers brushed Vivian's wrist. "Vivian, I looked at you like that because you are someone who cares. I saw it the first night. You held Leo's hand while the X-ray tech positioned his arm. You told him it was okay to be scared. You didn't have to do that. But you did." Vivian's eyes glistened. "Claire, I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Let someone see me. All of me. The parts that aren't steady. The parts that don't have a protocol." Claire smiled. It was small and tired, but real. "Neither do I. But maybe we can figure it out together." They sat in the hallway of the Cook County Courthouse. 2 women who had spent years learning how to be strong on their own, finally letting someone hold the weight. Vivian didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She just turned her hand over under Claire, Thing's fingers, and held on. 3 months later, the cast was gone. Leo Bennett held up his right arm in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. He flexed his fingers, then made a fist. Then he grinned at his mother with the kind of pure triumph only a 6-year-old could muster. "Look, Mom, no more dinosaur shell." Claire laughed from the counter where she was packing his lunch. "That's because the dinosaur inside it grew strong enough to come out." Leo considered this with great seriousness. "Dr. Viz said my bones are radiographically excellent. That means super good." "She's not wrong." Claire sealed the lunchbox and walked over to ruffle his hair. "You were very brave through all of it, you know." Leo shrugged, but his smile widened. "Dr. Viv said being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing it anyway." Claire's hand paused on his head. The words hit her in a place she hadn't expected, because Vivian had said the same thing to her. That night in the Kwangdu hallway, when she was shaking so hard she could barely hold the pen to sign the custody papers. The judge's ruling had come down 2 days after the hearing. Full custody to Claire, with supervised visitation for her ex-husband. The decision cited the mother's demonstrated stability and the child's expressed preference to remain in his current living environment. Claire had read that sentence 7 times before she finally believed it. That afternoon, she had driven to the hospital. Vivian was in her office, writing discharge notes. She looked up when Claire appeared in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire walked across the room, sat down in the chair across from Vivian's desk, and started crying. She cried for the months of fear, for the nights she held Leo a little too tight, for the moment in the courtroom when she thought she might lose everything. Vivian didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't offer platitudes. She just came around the desk, knelt beside the chair, and put her hand on Claire's knee. They stayed like that until the tears stopped. That was 3 months ago. Now, on a Saturday morning in late September, Claire and Leo were walking along the shore of Lake Michigan, the water lapping against the sand in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The sky was a clear blue, the air carrying the first hint of autumn chill. Leo ran ahead, collecting stones and shouting facts about prehistoric marine life. Claire followed at a slower pace, her hands in the pockets of her jacket. She wasn't alone. Vivian walked beside her, still in her weekend clothes, a soft gray sweater that made her look less like a surgeon and more like someone who might stay for breakfast.
Her hands were also in her pockets, but every few steps their shoulders brushed. Neither of them moved away. They had been doing this for a while now, the careful dance of proximity, the unspoken question of how close was too close. They had dinner together twice a week, always at Claire's apartment, because Vivian said her own place had too many takeout containers and not enough color. Leo would show Vivian his latest dinosaur drawings, and Vivian would tell him about the bones she'd seen that week, and Claire would watch them from the kitchen and feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Mom! Dr. Viv! Look!" Leo shouted from a few yards ahead. He was pointing at a large flat rock near the waterline. "It's a fossil! I think it's a trilobite!" Vivian smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "That's a very good eye, Leo, but I think that—" "Just a rock with a crack in it." Leo squinted at it. "Are you sure?"
87% sure.
"That means there's a 13% chance it's a trilobite," Leo said triumphantly.
Claire laughed. "He got your logic!"
"He got his mother's persistence,"
Vivian said quietly. They reached the rock, and Leo crouched down to examine it with the intensity of a paleontologist. Claire sat down on the sand, and after a moment, Vivian sat beside her. For a while, they just watched Leo, the waves, the gulls circling overhead. Then Claire reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it and handed it to Vivian. It was a drawing. 2 dinosaurs, one in a white coat, one holding a paintbrush. They were standing side by side, their tails intertwined, their heads tilted toward each other. At the top, in Leo's uneven 6-year-old handwriting, were the words, "2 dinosaurs who finally stopped hiding." Vivian stared at it for a long time. She blinked. Once. Twice. A tear slid down her cheek. Claire reached over and gently wiped it away. Her hand lingered on Vivian's jaw. "Vivian, he asked me the other day if you were going to be his other mom." Vivian's breath caught. "What did you tell him?" Claire smiled. "I said I didn't know yet, but I hoped so." The waves kept coming, the sun kept shining. Leo found another rock and declared it a dinosaur egg. Vivian turned to look at Claire, the woman who had brought her soup at midnight, who had sat beside her in a hospital cafeteria without saying a word, who had held her hand in a courthouse hallway and told her she was worth seeing. "Claire?" "Yes. I don't know how to do this perfectly." Claire's smile didn't waver. "Neither do I, but I want to try." Claire leaned in and pinned her forehead against Vivian's. Their breath mingled in the cool autumn air. "Trying is all I ask," Claire whispered. Behind them, Leo had abandoned the rock and was running toward them, holding something in his hand. "Dr. Viv, I found a real fossil. It's a—" He stopped when he saw them, foreheads together, eyes closed. Then he grinned. "Are you two doing a dinosaur greeting?" Vivian opened her eyes and laughed. It was a sound Playa had only heard a handful of times, but it was becoming more frequent. Each time, it felt like a small victory. "Something like that," Vivian said. Leo handed her the rock. It was just a rock, but Vivian held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "You know what, Leo?" she said. "What?" "I think this might actually be a fossil." Leo's eyes went wide. "Really?" "Really. We should take it home and look it up." "To your home or our home?" Vivian looked at Claire. Claire's eyes were soft, waiting. "Whichever one has the better dinosaur encyclopedia," Vivian said. Leo grabbed her hand. "Our home has 3 dinosaur books and a poster of a T-Rex skeleton. Mom says you can come over any time." Vivian let herself be pulled to her feet. She looked back at Claire, still sitting on the sand, watching them with a look that held no fear, no doubt. Claire stood up and brushed the sand off her jeans. She walked over and took Vivian's other hand. They walked down the beach, the 3 of them, Leo chattering about fossils and dinosaurs and the new drawing he wanted to make. The lake stretched out beside them, endless and calm. Vivian didn't let go. Neither did Claire. And somewhere in the distance, the waves kept coming. Not to break them, but to remind them that some things were worth staying for. And so, 2 dinosaurs finally stopped hiding. Not because the world was safe, but because they chose to face it together. If this story found a home in your heart tonight, I'd love to know. Where were you when you heard it? Drop a comment below, and until next time, keep your heart a little braver.
And so, two dinosaurs finally stopped hiding, not because the world was safe, but because they chose to face it together. If this story found a home in your heart tonight, I'd love to know. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep your heart a little braver.